All right, YouTube. Kim Jong-un was having a bad day, and so some Russian yachters that were in neutral waters, not even in the DPRK's territory. Unfortunately, these yachters, I guess, got picked up by the North Koreans, and now the emergency sort of, ambassadorial or whatever it is team in Russia is having a big to do over it. This has happened before. Before anyone thinks I'm like scaremongering, I'm saying, oh, it's atomic doomsday time. The North Koreans don't have enough nuclear weapons to make a doomsday, really, other than on their own fucking country getting turned into a parking lot by a single Satan missile delivered by the Russians. But it is still, concerning whether it's happened before or not. Anytime you have two nuclear states that spar, even a minor nuclear state like North Korea, it's the least among them, with, massively overpowered, rusted out tub of a military, but massively, as far as nukes go, massively overpowered Russia. Anytime you get that sort of sparring, you've got a problem. North Korea has gotten far more isolated, and this is why I say things on the Korean Peninsula are not the same as they were in the era of Kim Jong-il. I remember back then, I remember the posturing and the sort of we'll scare you by threatening a nuclear test, you'll send us rice. That was all well and good because back then the Russians were kind of neutral towards the North Koreans, didn't really give a shit. They have a tiny land border and a little bit of like a maritime border between them. Ultimately, they were ambivalent. They're like, yeah, maybe we'll buy some minerals from you. Here's some rice. It's all good. The Chinese were more or less allies of the North Koreans back then. But under Kim Jong-un, who seems to be acting remarkably unlike his father, the North Koreans have even gotten condemned by the Chinese. Like the last nuclear test, the Chinese are urging calm. The Russians are like, we're concerned about this. You hear some saber rattling increasingly among sort of the NATO sphere of the world. Their neighbors are not very happy with them. Even the South Koreans turning off their sort of the complex in North Korea, which is sort of a symbol of cooperation and eventual reunification between the North and South. Employs, I think, a few thousand North Korean laborers and some hundreds of specialists from South Korea. It's like a factory complex, like a free trade zone inside North Korea, sort of a symbol that, they don't want to nuke each other, I guess. And that's been shut down multiple times in the last couple of years. Multiple times you've had the DPRK firing off artillery randomly. They keep threatening nuclear tests. They've conducted at least one. It was not a hydrogen bomb, by the way, I assure you. It was a sub-megaton atomic weapon. They're making all of these weird threats. The North Koreans have always said one thing and done another for a long time. Like they'll say they want cooperation, the next day they'll conduct some sort of missile prototype test or something. That's common. What has changed is that the Chinese now openly condemn them, voted in favor of sanctions, or I think abstained. It didn't stop them from going forward. North Korea is still in the middle of a famine. Their economy is beginning to grind down, and things are getting more and more, I believe, difficult in the North Korean state. For them to do something at such a point that would potentially piss off the Russians, even if it's a more minor issue, that's nuts. You don't piss off. They've effectively disenfranchised themselves from all three of the world's major nuclear powers in the course of a couple of years. The United States hasn't been on their team anyway. But there was a time when there was a little bit of dialogue between the two. That's totally fucking gone. The Chinese are voting for sanctions, really turning back some of their ships. They're still sort of skirting the embargo and getting some coal and minerals delivered, but it's a trickle of what it formerly was. The Russians are no longer remotely a friend. I think what happened, it was funny. The Russians a couple years ago, I remember there was a meeting that Putin sort of had with these North Korean officials to talk about togetherness or whatever. And it looked almost like Russia was going to take them away from China and say, well, now this is our sort of little sphered atomic state, our own little version of Israel. And it looks like the North Koreans are so crazy that they actually rejected the Russians' offer, and or they didn't want to get screwed by Putin. Remember, Putin got screwed on the gas line deal from China. And he went back to Russia early in disgrace. He got completely screwed on the deal. He had no other choice but to sign the deal, and he got like pennies on the dollar for what he thought he'd get. And then of course, the fuel prices began to collapse. He's even more screwed. So the Chinese made out like bandits. So I think there's a little bit of pressure between the Russians and Chinese right now that they just don't want to talk about. I think things aren't quite hunky-dory between the two of them. As far as the North Koreans are concerned, though, who do they have as ally? The Iranians are now condemning them. Iran is condemning the North Korean state. I don't think there's a state left in the world today, other than maybe like Venezuela, that's even neutral towards them. I think they're like embargoed and condemned by every state on the face of the earth. They'd be hard-pressed, if they sent an official to the Vatican, they'd be hard-pressed to get that official to even be allowed to like make a confession or something. It's going to get real hard for them to justify the continued existence of the state. The only thing propping them up was the Chinese didn't want Korean unification, because then, like Japan, you have a relatively powerful and populous reunified Korea right on your doorstep, potentially with leftover atomic materials being backed by the United States. It's just another brick in the wall that's really around this sort of axis of Russia and China. But now with relations between the Chinese and North Korea and the Russians and North Korea at such critical levels, it seems, and with the Chinese and Russians not necessarily on the best of terms now either, even within the scope of BRICS, it's just starting to look all sorts of fucked up in this area that literally is an atomic flash zone in this world. So while I don't think war is going to break out over a detained Russian yacht, it's just another in a long series of misfortunes that Kim Jong-un is heaping on his own people. This isn't going to help him get out of an embargo. It's not going to help him get uncondemned by the Russians for conducting a nuclear test. Honestly, I don't know where the hell his mind is at. Maybe he's no longer really in control of the country, even though they had that elaborate ceremony. Oh yeah, he's no longer just the marshal. He's the grand marshal, glorious, eternal, unicorn riding, whatever. Okay, that's great, but the problem is it looks more and more like the generals are basically running the show, and some of them they weren't educated in foreign lands like Kim Jong-un was. Kim Jong-un was outside of North Korea for years. He studied on foreign terms. He knows what the outside world is like. Some of his generals don't. They've been to China maybe. Other than that, they've never been outside of North Korea. They've never been to Moscow. Certainly never been to like San Francisco or fucking Raleigh or something like that. They've never been to Australia. They've never been to Europe. They've been in North Korea most or all of their life. They don't necessarily realize, I think, truly, I think Kim Jong-un lords the fact that he knows what the outside world is like over some of those within his country that don't, and tries to convince them it really is like a post-apocalyptic hellhole out there. I wouldn't be surprised. It'd be a traditional strong-arm tactic, but when you keep your generals ignorant, they might make a mistake, especially if those generals essentially are doing their own thing at this point because they control the military. If Kim Jong-un's not in control, we have to ask ourselves who is. And even if he is, who's to say he's not like actually a lunatic? He's acting like one. He's not being like Kim Jong-il, where everything was obviously measured. They were trying to get some concessions. They wanted the shipment of rice in exchange for not firing off a missile. They get something, and they stop doing something that maybe they never intended to do anyway because it's too fucking expensive to fire that missile. Now Kim Jong-un's saying, oh, we're gonna keep testing these nukes. Oh, but a week ago he's like, we're concerned about nuclear proliferation and nuclear testing is bad, and now they're like moving stuff around at this usual testing site, making it look like they're setting up for a second atomic test in a year. Well, that would be kind of worrying. I don't think they've ever conducted two tests that close to one another before. People were saying, oh, maybe it was just a really large conventional explosive. Probably be more expensive than actually making an atomic weapon at that point. So yeah, the North Korean state's acting more and more frenetic, really. They're perturbing the eagle, the bear, and the dragon at the same time. I don't think that's a good idea. I believe Kim Jong-un is unaware of the fact that he is actually outnumbered here. I think maybe he actually believes all of his bullshit. If so, then total cuckoo. That's about all. Peace out.